Hello.
Hello,
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Doing good.
Good.
I was just about to kick off release workflow for 317.
Nice. No new issues that we've discovered?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Hi. Cool. Ow. My
Are you
back.
around later today to review and tag it?
Yeah, I should be able to.
Okay. Yeah. So that was one of the item I had in agenda. Do you have anything?
No, not for me. Do we want to end early, maybe?
Uh, Maybe we can brainstorm about what changes would be needed if you want to consider having an exporter interface for like any kind of driver.
Okay. Yeah, did you do the brainstorming about like use cases?
Yeah, so one of a couple of use cases we already discussed, right? Like somebody earlier wanted to have a Slack integration. Like earlier, also in the Slack channel, somebody
So
asked if
to clarify, we don't like integration would be via PubSub,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
there's no chance that pushing directly to Slack's API would be a good idea.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so uh, if I recall, the brainstorming was about use cases other than PubSub
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
that interface.
So somebody just in the Slack channel today asked that how to set alerting when policy denies any action. They didn't mention it to be through necessarily PubSub, but that is like one use case where we can have a driver for any sort of alerting. Another one would be just to write to disk or have a WebSocket opened in driver that and run a sidecar to read from that socket. So those are the couple of use cases I can think of.
And is there anything else that like I'm not convinced by the
Yeah,
alert one either. Like that one also seems like you wouldn't want to have a direct query path. Like
Mhm.
that's still like anti-pattern territory, right? Like you have increased the brittleness of the system
Yeah,
by having a that's the kind of thing that PubSub was intended for.
yeah.
Um, so writing to disk, I hear WebSocket. Sure, yeah, yeah. Um, anything else that we can think of?
Uh,
Rita talked about like audit results winding up being a way that's being like nominally at least using this pipeline so users could configure audit results using whatever system, as I imagine why that would be important, right? So it would at least look like a single pane of glass, even if it weren't.
I'm taking
Hey,
notes. Hello,
how's it going?
going good.
We are brainstorming because there's this PubSub driver interface thing that JDIP has been working on for a bit. There was a thought that it could be used for things other than PubSub. One example being streaming violations to disk. And so the question is, one, what changes to the interface might we want to have to make it more generic? And two, in that vein, what are other use cases that we can foresee in order to make sure we know the kinds of behaviors the interface should support so that all those use cases are possible?
Mm.
Uh,
I'm,
audit,
I'm curious on Slack messaging, right? Like it is possible to write a driver who which pushes uh, violations to a certain endpoint, and that endpoint API is responsible for delivering it to Slack itself, right?
right. That, I mean, that sounds like PubSub to me,
Yeah,
right? Like,
but it,
that's the problem, is that most of these calling out to API stuffs,
yeah,
if it is a blocking request, that's a bad idea, right? For latency reasons, availability reasons. If it's not a blocking idea, not a blocking request, it sounds like PubSub, right? Like you could imagine creating kind of like a spooling type system where uh, messages are sort of like cached and sent asynchronously, but that's PubSub.
I mean, even like so, if let's say right now we only have one use case, right? Like other than PubSub is writing to disk. Somehow the author of
We have
that,
two use cases: revamping audit to go through this, the
yeah,
audit reporting
yeah, yeah, yeah,
tool.
yeah.
Sorry, continue though.
Yeah, so I was just brainstorming, like even though let's say this driver exists right now, which writes to disk, it would be in benefit of the driver to have it do asyncly or in non-blocking way, right? Like blocking on writes for audit will just take much longer.
Uh, Audit would be well, I actually somewhat disagree that it matters with respect to audit. Webhook, yes, because latency sensitive.
Yeah,
Audit, if audit is running faster than the writes to disk regularly, you have a problem, right? Like that eventually will lead to whatever buffer you have overflowing. So, uh, given that audit is not a synchronous operation anyway, I would be less concerned there. Although, things like web requests, those are higher latency, so you can make like a stronger argument for, you know, you want the faster methods of reporting to not be bogged down.
yeah,
I mean, and WebSocket makes sense to me because sidecar, right? Like that's um, pretty useful. You could also, with WebSockets, think of like a UDP stream, but I'm kind of suspicious that there's much use there beyond what you would get from a PubSub queue, right? Like that could like tap in to, say, the raw feed, But if you wanted to have something like granular violation metrics, I think you'd still be looking at a sidecar anyway for that. But sidecars, you don't really need to make a choice there. Like WebSockets can point to adjacent processes, or they could point to arbitrarily distant. So in a sense, we're already kind of supporting the write directly to the Slack API use case merely by providing WebSockets.
Yeah.
They might need some sort of like intermediary server to handle the translation of the request format. And again, I wouldn't recommend doing that.
So one change is for sure, right? Like we definitely have to pass in clients now if we are thinking about moving, like eventually moving the reporting on constraints through provider or through driver.
I think we needed to pass in clients no matter what, even with just PubSub, right? Like I don't know why this is like a stuck point, but Dapper is just flat not sufficient for generic PubSub support, because it has the same kind of broken model as cert rotator, cert rotator, where it's running as a centralized service, right? And that just doesn't fly, right? Like, okay, so we depend on some specific version of Dapper, someone else depends on some other version of Dapper, let's say, right? Or we try to put Dapper in our Helm chart, right? But it runs as a one that like violates sort of our principle of not having third-party dependencies, and two, centralized dependencies in a Helm chart is like a well-known issue, right? With like CRDs, and this is still a worse case. So, sorry to rant a little bit, but even saying we will support PubSub, I think puts us on the hook for not just Dapper, but probably the other large PubSub clients, right? RabbitMQ, and whatever else is out there. I think Redis is some sort of like PubSub thing, maybe.
So I was specifically talking about Kubernetes like Go client instance and not the pub sub client instance.
I
Because if we
don't
want,
think. Wait, is there a difference between the two? Like, you would need a different client for each of those, was my point.
oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah. So for case of like yeah. So what I meant was basically that right now we don't like in PubSub system we don't pass in on cluster client to modify resources that are already on cluster. But if we are eventually wanting driver for updating constraint status, we want that client to be passed in and be stored in the PubSub system itself or in the driver itself as well.
I mean, maybe. I to some extent. mm, I'm not 100% sure what the audit thing would look like, right? Like, you could imagine it. Like, honestly, the audit results writer stuff is a Golang thread anyway, right? So that is already separated out. Uh, yeah, so it could just like look like taking that code and rewrapping it in this driver. Sorry, I got lost in my train of thought. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what point you were making and if I was responding to that,
No,
to be honest.
I'm just thinking about differences and changes that we would need to make in terms of interface and what needs to be passed down from audit or let's say webhook if we ever decide to integrate the system under webhook as well. And one
Mhm.
of the things that stood out that for sure we need a Go client or Kubernetes client to be passed if we are thinking about um, moving moving the constraint updates under driver.
I don't think that necessarily follows. Like, I agree that some sort of like Kubernetes information needs to be piped through somehow.
Yeah.
But if the driver is instantiated and then passed to whatever instance, right? The constructor for driver can look however the driver author wants it to look, right? So you can have a driver that accepts a Kubernetes client, or you can have a driver that accepts an IP address or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, the overall framework doesn't need to know about that. The framework just needs to provide an interface that these drivers can satisfy that has all the functional needs that these drivers have, right? So we can assume in terms of like passing dependencies, right? If we make it a principle of design that the framework has no role in the constructing of the driver, right? So that's the driver author. They just like create some Golang struct that meets some interface, and how that gets created is up to them. Then, as far as the framework is concerned, what we're left with is supporting things like maybe batching, right?
Yeah.
Maybe cache flushing if we're talking about writing to disk. Like I'm not sure there. Um, let's see what selecting of data streams, right? So that would look like for a pub sub thing, at the very least, like the queue to be used, but also with something like Dapper, there's different pub sub backends that we could point to, right? And then for something like writing to disk, we would be looking at potentially writing to different files, potentially writing different tags to the individual output lines, right? Like we haven't designed what the output lines look like, but
Yeah.
syslog and all that, like
So to be fair, those output lines would be designed by author, right? Like not the interface itself, because
yes, this is accurate, but the author needs to have the data available
yeah. So
to.
right now in the interface we have a channel or a topic and the violation itself. Shouldn't that be sufficient? I mean, that's sufficient right now, but for disk also, I would assume that's more than sufficient, right?
I don't know. That's why we would want to
Yeah.
brainstorm, right? What are the different use cases and what could we see them wanting to do? Because one, we probably want to choose more generic names than just like channel and topic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, because otherwise it's very clearly like pub sub is like
Yeah.
the first class citizen, and like cool if you can like use that data. Two, uh what are the kind of models that we want to support, right? Different sorry, I'm gonna like repeat words that I've already said, like different files, different annotations on the lines. You could imagine adding like extra contextual data, maybe. I don't know. Batching in a certain way could be considered contextual data. Um, like if you had a batch, for instance, so for admission, right? There's potentially with expansion more than one object that can be created, or sorry, that can be subject to admission with like the expansion template stuff, right? Like a deployment creates like a pod, right? So is the batch like per object, or is it per admission request? And is the granularity of the batch like if there are multiple violations, right? Like how does that relate to things? Or do we need multiple layers of metadata, right? Like, okay, so we have a request, and then we have the actual object, and then we have the violations against the actual object, and then we have like inferred objects, those like generated objects, and those particular violations. Like, is that data density that we want to maintain? Because we could provide it. Is it useful to provide? I don't know. Like, authors of, or sorry, consumers of the pipeline are free to ignore whatever data they're not interested in at the cost of maybe some complexity.
So
Uh,
right now, for current behavior, that data we are not providing in terms of logs or audit message or webhook STD outs, right?
Correct, because we own the code, so it didn't matter, right? Like we put all of our effort into the API in terms of like, what does the rejection logline look like, and what is the response from the webhook, or more interestingly, excuse me, what does Gator return? Because we have more control over the Gator API, obviously, than the admission webhook. Because
So
Kubernetes.
what you are suggesting is like if in future we decide to enable that streaming or additional metadata logging or reporting, like for Getter, audit, and webhook denies, it wouldn't really matter because we control the code as to now it's provider's decision to whether or not or how to ignore those messages, so we need to consider it beforehand.
So my observation was, by providing an interface and by telling people, hey, you can develop on top of this interface, we now need to take backwards compatibility into account, right?
Yeah.
And so there's, and when backwards compatibility is taken into account, there's sort of two somewhat related problems in API design, right? There is one, there's certain assumptions or design choices you're going to make that are kind of like one-way doors, right? And if you uh, decide to change anything about those core assumptions, you're going to be forced to make a backwards incompatible change. But two, there's also, you can make intentional choices to basically leave space to add extra data over time in a way that is backwards compatible, usually at the cost of some kind of extra complexity, right? There's more data to parse. Maybe if we had thought of the use case beforehand, it would have been simpler to write against. And now people need to like, do post processing to recompose stuff or whatever. Um, and so the thought is, what we're essentially proposing is to hand a new interface out to people, and knowing sort of how they may want to use that interface is important for making decisions around where are we okay having a one-way door? Where do we need to leave room for complexity, or sorry, extra data density, and like how can we introduce that over time? And so why I was sort of harping on the batching thing is because to me that is like one of the more interesting, harder knots to untangle, right? Because one, batching can mean different things in different places, right? Like audit may have a different sense of what it means to batch than the webhook. Two, batching necessarily invokes this notion of grouping, right? Like it doesn't, batches don't have to be groups, obviously, right? For pub sub batching, you could almost consider it more of a like network efficiency thing, right? To limit the number of outgoing requests. But it is also the case that there is this sort of like temporal coherence to a lot of gatekeepers stuff, right? Like every request is a discrete event, right? That is being handled. Every audit run is maybe a discrete event, or maybe you would consider it every resource in an audit run or every constraint, and in terms of what that means for consumption, I would imagine that different use cases are going to prioritize different groupings, right? Like if you think about something that's just wants to tap, hey, just give me a stream of everything that's happening, right? That's very simple. But if you wanted to create some sort of like, I don't know, debugging pipeline that was able to, for a given admission request, let you unpack what the inferred objects were, right? And which constraints were violated and which objects that violation was associated with, blah, blah, blah. You could imagine needing extra data density that usually is not needed in order to make those decisions. None of these, by the way, is like a complete thought or me like saying like I know what the answer is. I'm just like trying to show like how, where we could get into the weeds and sort of like intelligently draw the line and figure out, okay, no, we're thinking too hard about things after this point, right? Or okay, we explicitly can kind of foresee these kinds of use cases and want to make sure that we're good here. Or maybe the correct tack is, you know what, we know that we cannot really predict, so we want to leave the potential for API growth over time. And we're willing to make things look like a little bit like weird and wonky and absorb some like complaints from users trying to integrate, just so that we're not painted in a corner in the future.
So
Yeah. Okay.
specifically, these kind of the use case that you just described, like that can be hidden behind a flag as well from gatekeeper admin side.
Which could be hidden behind a flag?
Uh, do we want to stream or increase the data density in terms of reporting, like underlying resources in case of expansion template?
Oh no, I don't think we can or want to hide it behind a gatekeeper flag. I think this would be the purpose of having a more generic driver, is then it's the user's choice which flags and how they want to tune it, right? Like anyone can write a driver and not be beholden to our choices in terms of how they tap the data stream. There might be performance implications with handing everything off, right? Maybe we do need to have some sort of filtering, but that's my first thought. So Am I overwhelming you, or is does this?
No, you definitely have different and interesting ideas than I do, because when I was thinking about changes that may require in order for this PubSub, I was just for this interface, I was thinking, like, do we want to support multiple drivers? We currently only support one at a time, one connection and one driver at a time. Do we want to support running multiple drivers at a time, or stuff like that? So yeah, I didn't think about these kind of use cases, so it's definitely good.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two problems, right? There is the problem of like wiring the pipes together, right? And then there's a problem of what is running through those pipes. The wiring the pipes together, yeah, that's the pub sub WebSocket, blah blah blah. What is running through the pipes? If we are assuming we're just looking to post violations, right? That could be a fairly simple problem. The question I would have though is how ambitious do we want to be with the system then, right? Like if we're just looking for a way to shove violations through that are observed by various enforcement points, maybe not so ambitious. If we're looking to have this be sort of like build your own reporting infrastructure on top of Gatekeeper, uh, we probably want to be more ambitious.
So that's the uh, th- is this so let's say, for example, what I'm thinking right now is, like, we can probably introduce this mechanism under constraint scoped enforcement action, where, like, you can theoretically add one more field saying that, hey, whatever getter denies, I want to pipe through PubSub thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then on top of that, there would be one more setting saying that, if, like, do I need to increase density or not, like, in terms of um, underlying sub resource or whatever it may be. So those changes could be piped through constraints. Yes, I'm just bring constraints enforcement action. I'm just brainstorming here, because earlier when I was thinking about it, like, one of the choices we made to include topic through interface and not through config resources, because we left some scope of defining that same topic on constraints, right? Like, for different constraints, if users want to have different topics, then that could be done through that one. So additionally, we can expand upon the same idea for and provide these configurations through constraints.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and if we like genericize that a little bit, sorry, I'm trying to think. Like, what's interesting about that is we're definitely encouraging some sort of like taxonomy for routing, right? Um, and that would imply that we are just looking at kind of like a pipe for violations, and we're not looking to really dig much more deeper than that, which is fine.
Do we also imagine multiple use cases? Let's say, for example, like, certain type of constraints and violation, I want it reported on constraint status, but for other types, I want it reported through a channel, or for certain types, I want to write it on disk. Sorry to cut you off. You were saying something.
Oh, no. So that would basically be you would not only select like the metadata, but you would select the driver itself. Interesting. So that would imply like basically 3 levels of addressing, or maybe 2, right? Because Dapper is interesting in that you're choosing a backend and a topic. But then if you go to just a raw pub sub, the backend is basically defined by the driver, right? You could have multiple instances of the RabbitMQ uh, uh, backend, like a driver pointing to different backends.
So that's the thing. Right now, we only support one connection of each backend. So it's just pointing to one endpoint.
That was the overfitting on Dapper, to be blunt.
Okay, but so I do you remember I raised a PR a little while ago, which basically removed the flag which we shouldn't do, and assumed. So I recall two reasons being why we decided to be like why we decided to support only one at this time. One is because we were reconciling on config map, so we just don't want to reconcile on every config map, and assume it's there up for connection. So we basically followed the same approach as gatekeeper configs, where gatekeeper config resource name config is only reconciled, and that resource only gets synced uh, in the gatekeeper. So that was one of the reason, and other maybe the one you just said, that we might have overfitted on that part.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm sorry, I'm in a blunt mood today, but I think there was a lot of naivety uh, in the initial design here. Like, there was fear of adding still more complexity, still more GVKs, was why people were like, can we just use config maps? That pretty quickly collapsed. It turns out the problem isn't the number of GVKs, right? Like, if anything, GVKs like simplify things because you can use RBAC, you can actually get schema, that kind of stuff. There's just fatigue around how many GVKs are we going to implement. And I think there was also a desire to simplify the initial implementation, and that's where the flags came in, right? We're like, can we just do this for
Yeah.
audit for now? Because then we don't need to worry about latency and capacity concerns associated with webhooks. Excuse me. And with audit, we could just like hard code the topics and the backends, and that way we don't need to solve this other harder problem of how to actually configure which topic and driver it should go to on the constraint, because at the time all we had was enforcement action, right? We
Yeah.
didn't have
Yeah.
the fancier enforcement action stuff that we have now, the scoped enforcement actions. So yeah, but there was, I think, an acknowledgement that we didn't want to like overfit on Dapper. I think we had somewhat made that mistake with open
Census?
telemetry. Uh,
Yeah.
not entirely. We had some interface
We do
wrapped
have
around
metrics
open
in, yeah.
telemetry, but or open census it was at the time. That's right. I think there, if I remember right, in our discussions we had, and it's been like a year and a half. there was talk about how we could basically fake the sorry, I'm gonna get the terms wrong for Dapper here, but I think was it Dapper has topic and backend, I want to say, or is it
By backend, do you mean different data or state stores through which Dapper routes the messages?
exactly? Yeah, like
Yeah.
one of many RabbitMQ
Yeah,
instances,
yeah,
OS instances, whatever. Okay, so we could kind of like fake that with a RabbitMQ versus like RabbitMQ where you'd have one driver per RabbitMQ connection by basically having Dapper pretend like it's multiple drivers, right? Like you would create like a core Dapper driver and then you would wrap that Dapper driver around one that had hard coded a certain backend. And so the driver selection would be equivalent to backend selection.
but right now we do have multiple like driver selection possible, right? Like if I want to add one more driver than Dapper, I can add it and it works.
Right. I was trying to remember, and I think I may have lost the thread of like what we were trying to figure out here.
Yeah,
But
so we were basically talking about like different uh, level of configurations that maybe we see users desiring, like one of which was maybe enhancing scoped enforcement action to provide different, like to provide for different connections and different backend, or have scoped enforcement use different drivers to publish different kind of messages for different enforcement points or actions.
hmm. The
And
other thing
before,
was, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
before that we were talking about like taxonomy and configurations that users may be needed to provide, like on the same plan.
Yeah, the one thing that strikes me with this expanded use case idea is the level of coupling between the constraint and the infrastructure that's evaluating the constraint that it implies, right? Like, is this more like a listener model now? If we do something like this, so if I use scoped enforcement actions, right, and I give hints on the constraints saying like, hey, I think any violation here is actually like internal governance related and specifically related to this particular team. Is that do I want to do that versus do I want to say, hey, if there's a violation, I want to publish it to this specific pub sub queue that is relevant to this particular that team, right? And I think the salient difference there is with the first model, you're providing like company semantic context, right? Like here is the intent behind the constraints. And then you could have the various drivers self identify. So you could, for a single declaration, have both a pub sub driver and a write to log driver pick it up. Interesting. Interesting.
I didn't
Okay.
finish what the last thought of yours. Can you repeat?
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Let me start from a slightly different place. So I'm thinking about two possible ways a constraint could look under the scoped enforcement action regime, right? And there is one option where when a user writes a constraint, they have a enforcement action metadata kind of thing where they say like, hey, this is a billing and ownership constraint, right? Like this being unhappy means that my billing and ownership team should be unhappy with the state of this resource, right? And the other way of writing it would be, hey, if this constraint is violated, publish it to the billing and ownerships team's pub sub queue, right? The difference between those is that the author of the constraint in the second one needs to know that billing has a pub sub queue. And if they decide to like re-architect things so that that stops being true, because they're like, no, we just want to have like a batch processing pipeline for logs or whatever.
So on
Then
constraint side, sorry to cut you off, but what you are saying in on constraint side, should it be just that this constraint is intended for pushing violations on like either logs or PubSub or disk or constraint statuses or combination of either of those, or it should say that hey, using this PubSub queue, this specific PubSub queue, you and this specific driver, this constraint should report violation.
yeah, I don't know if these are mutually exclusive either. Like you could have both, right? Like you could, uh,
One is basic, but so in the former one, we need a coupling on gatekeeper or interfaces side, right? Like to intelligently pick up on which constraint wants to push where.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And that would be like a listener model. It would almost be like an internal pub sub thing, like where you could say, hey, this driver is interested in these topics. I see your mouth moving, David, but you're muted if you're trying to say something.
No, just listening in.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, yeah, I don't think these are necessarily mutually exclusive because there is also, you could imagine the person who's taking the approach of, no, I own everything. I just have different places where I want this data to go, right? Like I own the full stack, I own the constraints. They would find that kind of level of abstraction kind of annoying, right? It would be yet another thing to configure. So what are we left with here? We've got this thought, which I am less convinced of the more we talk about it, of hey, do we want to be extra fancy with the data density? I'm starting to think more and more no. Because I think that makes it harder for us to support what I think is the more interesting use case, which is focused on like the author of the policies and them being able to like more easily model their policies to either their infrastructure needs or their corporate needs. Um,
But then one more thing uh, I was thinking about is that should it be on policy like template author or should it be on constraint author to uh, make a decision on these kind of things?
Absolutely not the template author. Because like gatekeeper library is an example, right? Like we cannot know how how everyone is setting up gatekeeper. Yeah,
So
and
the argument is basically the enforcement happens with creation of constraints. So that resources author has to be responsible for however it is being treated.
right, and well, it's sort of like a joint responsibility between whoever is installing gatekeeper and
Yeah.
the author of the constraints. And also we need to, sorry to like expand things out, but like gator, right? Like that's worth thinking about as well. Uh, yeah, Gator. That's an interesting one because Gator, some of this stuff, like it could write out like pub sub and writing to separate files makes sense for just as much sense for Gator as it does Gatekeeper. But then also there's just like output customization, right? Like writing to different IO pipes or whatever. Is that too fancy? What would people want to do with Gator? You know, like we already sort of like right now I feel like Gator's most salient interface points are the return codes, right? Like is the threshold any warning or any violation, like any deny, before you return a non-zero return code, right? And that's directly relevant to get pre-submit hook. But then also the schema of standard out, right? Like one thing that I don't know if people are using this, right? But Gator, you can ask for like JSON formatted output, I believe it is, and use that for like processing of the results. And yeah, I don't know. Like, are we now looking at a system that is just pushing to these different drivers that push to these other infrastructure bits? Or are we looking at a more semantic thing? Or both? And what impact might that have on Gator? Anyway, so it's a large question. So, given there's like 6 minutes left,
Yeah. What are the next steps for me then?
right now that we've like exploded out the universe of possibilities, can we like narrow it down again so we can actually do something? I think for me, I have sort of talked myself into, and let me know if you disagree, that we're looking at like a dumb pipe of violations. We're not trying to do anything fancier than that.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I am interested in this question of routing, right? And whether we want to cite specific drivers, do pub sub, or sorry, do sort of like this observer pattern that's more semantically flexible, or both, and what impact either choice would have on the scoped enforcement actions API, because that's something that we're looking at improving as part of this, right? Or are we looking at these as separate questions?
So this is a like an exercise to keep room for improvements, right? Like we are not specifically looking to implement this as part of this one. I think that makes the scope too big. We can just think about changing interface and then maybe writing a driver that writes to disk and then rethink about like routing mechanism. But we definitely do want to support it, and that's one of the choices we made in the first iteration as well, right? For introducing audit channel flag itself to have a global routing channel there, and then if possibly we can add that support. So similarly, I think we want to do the same.
Okay, so what I'm hearing then is we're deferring the routing question just entirely right now, and we're just looking at the driver bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So given the current solution exists, what would be the changes, right? And then we can reiterate once we modify that interface. We can reiterate on like supporting multiple drivers, discussing about this interesting use cases where like how do we couple constraints with pubsub or like with exporter, like how much extra abstraction do we provide, and that sort of stuff. But I think like that making that distinction and line is really difficult because like at what point do we say that yeah confidently that this interface that we came up with may address all these changes in future.
I think this may be easier than we're making it out to be. So if we have just this driver, okay, let's just pretend we have a driver
Okay.
interface that accepts just, and I'm going to call it for now, topic and message, right? And I'm not going to go into the type problem, but that's something that should be gone into like as part of this. Doesn't talk about backend, doesn't have any more fancier customization than that. If we use what I just said about Dapper as an example, right? Let me where Dapper you can kind of fake multiple drivers writing to the same core Dapper connection, right? And so you have like 5 Dapper drivers, and really you've hard coded a specific backend, right? And which driver you select really just is you specifying the backend. If I take that model to the extremes and I look at like logging, users are kind of free to do whatever. You can create like a kernel driver thing that knows how to write to one or multiple files on the disk, knows how to serialize each entry, whether that's JSON with some metadata around like extra topic information or whatever. And then you can create multiple drivers that access that same kernel, right? And have hard coded different values in terms of like this particular driver writes to this file with this like line prefix. This other driver writes to that same file with a different line prefix. This third file, a driver writes to a different file with a completely different line prefix.
So
It You do get in like an extreme case an explosion of drivers. I don't know if that's a problem because like at that point you're looking at the routing issue, right? Like so a constraint needs to know which drivers it's routing to and how complex do you want that syntax to be. Have I sold you? Because the other way of doing this would be to somehow leave room on the constraint to add some of this extra contextual information. And that would have the impact then of the driver would need to be able to read that contextual information and handle it, which we can maybe do both, right? There's a reason why constraints have that details in the violation header, that details field. Do you remember? Yeah, there's like message and then there's details.
oh yeah.
Yeah, like you could have the same kind of idea there. Anyway, we're at time, but do you have any thoughts about what I just said?
uh yeah, so what's the action item? I missed it, sorry.
If you like my model of every driver just accepts a single string, and then we can
Okay.
build multiple drivers like that sort of fan-in kind of model we have for Dapper, I might be misremembering what we're doing for
So,
Dapper there, or maybe we just never bothered to do it because we had the flags. But you could have this fan-in model. Um,
but that would mean that we are supporting multiple connection at a time.
it doesn't mean anything. Like the interface is just send message and here's a random string that is like the companion to the message. Where for a pub sub thing, that string would be the topic. For logging, it would be whatever they decide that the string should be. Um, and then if a driver author wanted to get fancy, like Dapper got fancy and have multiple backends, right? Well, then you have like the actual driver, right? The thing that does the communication with Dapper. And then you have basically virtual drivers, which are wrappers around the actual driver, and hard code which backend Dapper should be reaching out to. And so to Dapper, it looks like you have a single connection that could go to any of, let's say, 5 backends. And to Gatekeeper, it looks like you have 5 drivers.
So that's the confusing part to me, right? Like right now, as the version of interface we have, it's gonna be only one connection and one driver at a time. Even though you have multiple driver, there is only one connection that you.
That doesn't matter, though,
Okay,
because
so
the
that
interface.
change isn't part of interface. It's part of a mechanism that we want to support later on. So or may not want to support later on.
So the interface is just what Gatekeeper needs, right? And then how the driver author decides to satisfy that interface and whatever clever tricks they want to do under the hood, that's up to them, right? And so what I'm saying is if all you have is the topic string and the message, um, that doesn't keep you from having 5 different
Yeah,
drivers that satisfy that interface that are really just the same Dapper connection. Uh, I don't know. Are we talking past each other or?
I get your point, but like I'm thinking about how Gatekeeper interacts with this interface, right? Like the said interface. Even though, let's say theoretically, I can write five different drivers, Gatekeeper only supports one connection config map right now.
Well, one, the config map thing is going away.
Yeah,
So we should like not. We should absolutely not be thinking about the connection config map
but
stuff.
let's say it gets replaced by a custom resource definition, right?
Mhm.
Um, of its own kind. Even then, do we want to follow the same path as uh, the config kind we are following right now, where only one object of config named config gets reconciled and GVK is mentioned under it? We essentially want to move forward to supporting multiple connections, right? That's all I'm asking.
One, I think almost certainly the multiple connections, but two, I think that's separate than the driver concern because um,
So that's the thing,
the
right? Like right now in config map, we require a property to be set that indicates this connection should be established for whichever driver.
right. I And if you have stuff like writing to standard out, already that you're breaking the one-to-one association between these configs and these drivers, which is fine, right? The configs can be one way for controlling which drivers exist or don't exist in Gatekeeper. Like, sorry, this is going to take us way over time if we keep talking about it, but
So that's all
like
right. If you want to drop, I'll just iterate what I need to do next, and then we can circle back next week.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But I would say do not consider the driver interface and how drivers are configured to be tightly coupled to each other. And you could have multiple ways of configuring drivers at the same time. Some provided at initialization via flag, right? Like writing out to standard out or whatever, and others configured dynamically via KRM objects. Like that's not impossible to do.
Yeah, it's okay. Cool. So thinking about we only want to pipe the violation message and provide a string. A string or topic channel, whatever you want to call it. I'll write the design document or complete the design document, and then we can discuss further.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Right.
Bye.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Right.